Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Charis. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be here tonight in celebration of Like a House on Fire, Lauren McBrayer's brand new book. Lauren is a graduate of Yale with a law degree from UC Berkeley. She is a working mom of 3 and the head of business affairs for an entertainment company in Los Angeles. Like a House on Fire is her adult debut, but as you may hear, she has written some other YA books as well, and in addition to all these other impressive things that she has done with her life. And she's joined today by Susan Landrum. Folks from Charis know Susan as a board member of Charis Circle. She served on our board since 2015. She's a native of Atlanta and first stepped into Charis as a senior in high school to be part of the Young Writers Group led by Linda Bryant. This transformative experience forever shaped her understanding of intersectional feminism and planted the seeds of love for community building and writing. Susan most recently served as the executive director for Vox ATL, Atlanta's home for uncensored teen publishing and self-expression. She currently is pursuing a Master's of Divinity degree from Columbia Theological Seminary, right here in Decatur, Georgia, and she is fueled by plenty of coffee, books, friendship, family, and perfect spring days in Atlanta. So welcome to you both. I'm really, really happy to have you here. Happy to the other Atlanta connection, or really Roswell connection, is that Lauren went to the same high school as the Charis Circle treasurer, Ellen Rapier. So this is like a real hometown event. Even though you've been in California for quite a while, we're trying to claim you, Lauren, for Georgia. So welcome to everybody wherever you're watching from. Feel free to shout out in the chat, say hello, and feel free to ask questions if you like. You may do that at the Ask a Question tab, or you can put it in the chat and I'll move it over so that Susan knows where to find it. But welcome to you both. I know that we're in for a great conversation.
Thank you.
So, Lauren, I just have to say that I have loved reading this book. I think it is a necessary book. I think it is deeply queer. I think it's deep in general. And I really could not put it down. I resented that I had other things to do. I'm really grateful that you've written it. And I really want everybody who's watching to definitely purchase a copy. And I also want to put it in the hands of everybody I know. I thought I'd share just a little bit about it and then pass it off to you, if that's okay.
Great.
So just a little background about the plot. This is a book about Merritt. She is 39, almost 40. She's been pursuing a career as a painter, and she's been raising young children when she decides to return to a more traditional 9-to-5 role at an architecture firm. And she meets an incredible human named Jane. And I'm just going to say that Jane is enigmatic. She's brilliant. She becomes a dear friend of Merritt's and a very big love. And I don't want to give any more away, and that's where I'll stop. But Lauren, I'm just wondering, how did this book bubble up for you? Where did it come from? Can you talk a little bit about your inspiration?
Yeah, definitely. And bubble up is the right phrase. In 2019, I had written those 3 YA novels that ER mentioned. And I knew the last one came out in 2017. And I knew when it came out that I did not have another young adult book in me. I was done with that. And I knew I wanted to write something different, but I wasn't sure exactly what. And so it'd been a couple of years and I hadn't written anything, substantial. And I went on a girls' weekend with some women I didn't know very well for one friend's 40th birthday, but she brought a bunch of people I didn't know. And I took a nap by the pool and woke up with these women in my head. And, in retrospect, I can piece together who Merritt was to me and who Jane was to me. But in the moment, they felt like just these fictitious characters that had a rapport, and I could hear them. I could hear their banter, which I think you see a lot of in the book, just sort of the way they interact with each other. I saw their age difference. And they just kind of demanded that I pay attention to them. So I just saw this book. I could just see it, and I knew what it was. And what I thought it was a story about modern marriage and the disillusionment of, midlife, and sort of putting everything that you've wanted together and then realize you're deeply unhappy, but also like so privileged that you feel like a jerk for acknowledging it. And then the power of female friendship to sort of rescue you from that. So I thought what would happen is these women would meet and their friendship would become everything. And then for one moment or day, they'd cross over to being more and then come back to just being friends and go back to their marriages and go back to their lives, like better for it. No spoilers. That's not the book I ultimately wrote. So I just started writing the story, and the two women, they showed me who they were. And once I sort of took them on the journey, and they, I don't think it's a spoiler to say they fall in love. You can read to figure out exactly how. Sort of no going back. So it became really organically the story that it is through just knowing my characters and letting them take me, where they wanted to go.
Yeah, it is an incredible development of their relationship. It moves through a lot of different phases and a lot of different energies, which I really appreciate. And I'm wondering if you would want to share maybe like a little section of the book, maybe that part that we talked about where they meet the first time.
Yes, I will read from the first chapter. So the first chapter of the book is Merritt interviewing at this architecture firm. She's hasn't been working for about 3.5 years because she took some time off to try to be a painter. She failed miserably. Some might say because she's not that talented of a painter. Others might say because her husband wouldn't let her get childcare while she was trying to paint, and she had a newborn while she was trying to put her pieces together. You judge. So this is the interview scene when Merritt first meets Jane. Jane's work had been featured in all the major design magazines. So Merritt had seen plenty of photos of her potential new boss leaning across $10,000 dining tables in spectacularly staged homes. But none of those images had done Jane justice. Watching her that morning, head tilted back in a laugh, blonde hair falling away from her face to reveal the sharp, precise features that had seemed too severe online, Merritt decided that the problem with all the photos was that Jane wasn't smiling in any of them. She looked striking and stylish in every shot, but not beautiful. The woman in the conference room, by contrast, was fucking gorgeous. Warm, radiant, glowing the way that attractive women who drink enough water and sleep more than 4 hours at a time often do. Merritt felt like a homely, dehydrated teenager in her ill-fitting black pants and stretchy striped t-shirt, which that morning had seemed like a hip fashion choice, but clearly was a wild lapse in judgment. Jane Lodahl was a ravishing adult woman, Scandinavian, from Denmark, who probably didn't even own t-shirts. In fact, Jane possessed no fewer than 200 of them, all white, black, or gray. The day of Merritt's interview, Jane was wearing a black A-line midi dress with gold buttons down the front, the kind that costs 5 times what you think it should and only looks good on women with tiny waists and curvy hips. Merritt's own body resembled a stretched out unitard on a coat hanger, droopy and mostly shapeless, except for the sad little sacks where her tits and ass used to be. Nothing about Jane was droopy, shapeless, or sad. At 56, Jane had phenomenal tits and an enviable ass. The body of a woman who'd never had children, Merritt told herself, to make herself feel better. It made her feel worse. Merritt couldn't have described the very particular sensation in her stomach as she watched Jane hop up on the slab table in the conference room, legs dangling, while the 4 men she was meeting with stood around awkwardly in their stiff pants and skinny pants and stiff shoes. Jane was always sitting on tables and leaning on counters, putting her full weight on things the same way she liked to bear down on people, as if to see what they were made of. It would take a long time for Merritt, who was typically quite perceptive, to understand that Jane's oppressive self-confidence, finely calibrated to elicit unease in others, was an affectation she'd cultivated to get ahead in a profession dominated by men. But Merritt didn't know any of this the day she interviewed at Jager Brandt. All she knew for certain as she followed Jane into her office that morning was that she desperately wanted this extraordinary woman to hire her. As she perched nervously on one of the many chairs clustered around Jane's desk, it occurred to Merritt that she'd been so preoccupied with coming up with the right story to explain the 3.5 years she'd taken off from architecture to pursue fine art that she'd neglected to ask herself whether she actually wanted the job she was there to try to get. Sitting across from Jane, she felt as if she wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. So you took some time off to paint, Jane said, one eyebrow arched as she began to doodle aggressively on the copy of Merritt's resume lying on the desk. She had a slight Danish accent and a nearly imperceptible overbite, which Merritt might not have noticed had she not been staring exclusively at Jane's mouth, which was decidedly less intimidating than her eyes. I did, Merritt said, and was pleased at how undefensive her voice sounded. Jane obviously already knew this. Merritt had explained the clear gaps in her resume in the cover letter she'd fired off after 3 too many glasses of rosé the previous Monday night. The wine wasn't her savviest move, but if she was going back to work, it would be on her terms. Unconventional was the word she'd used in the letter, despite the fact that Corey had told her it was code for weird and that she should call her career path entrepreneurial instead. Merritt didn't see how spending 3 years trying to make enough art for a single gallery show could properly be called entrepreneurial. Plus, trying to frame her failed creative pursuit as a clever career move made her feel desperate and pathetic, and she was neither of these things. Technically, this job was the only real possibility she had, and yes, their mounting credit card bills demanded that she start getting a paycheck. But she had a B.Arch from Cornell and a master's from Berkeley. She had to be at least as competent as 90% of the architects at her level. So if she didn't get this particular job at this particular firm, there would be another one. There was no need to panic yet. And Jane said, leaning back in her chair, propping her feet up on her desk, she wrapped her dress around her legs and tucked it between her knees. Merritt wondered if she was wearing underwear. Merritt lifted her eyes to Jane's. Utter failure, she answered. I only sold one piece, which was barely enough to cover the gallery's costs. So here you are, Jane said. Here I am. Jane studied her for a moment. Merritt forced herself not to look away. Jane's eyes were very blue. Merritt sensed that Jane was trying to make her uncomfortable. Instead, she felt uncommonly alive. You have the credentials, obviously, Jane said, but are you any good? She hadn't bothered to open Merritt's portfolio. Merritt didn't hesitate. I wouldn't waste your time if I weren't. Jane arched an eyebrow. And you're sure you're ready to come back to the grind? Definitely, Merritt lied. I'll always love fine art, but I'm hardwired for the faster pace of architecture and design. She cringed a little at this last bit. It had sounded less cheesy in her head. And I'm apparently hardwired to get fucked in the ass by incompetent middle-aged men who keep falling up, said Jane dryly. She crossed her ankles. You have kids? Merritt hesitated, in part because her mind was still stuck on the transition from ass fucking to children, but also because she knew that a woman without kids, asking another woman about her children in a prospective employment situation, rarely turned out well for the one with the kids. A girl's allowed one lapse in judgment, Merritt heard herself say, or 2, in my case. Jane didn't say anything, but Merritt saw a hint of a smile. She leaned forward in her chair and put her palms on Jane's desk. She couldn't have said what came over her. It was unlike her to be so crass. Please hire me. I need to get the fuck out of my house. Jane laughed uproariously, and Merritt knew she had the job. The end.
There's like so much in that exchange in between these two characters, which I just want to say is one of the things that I loved about the book. Like the world is small, but the relationships are so big that there's just so much life experience happening between these people. So there's a lot there, but I really want to dig into something that I noticed in the scene, which is how queerness is functioning in this very particular way that I've come to realize in my own experience is this tension between, am I attracted to this person or do I want to be this person? And so I'm curious to just hear your take on that, if that resonates, and also kind of how queerness functions in the book, outside of just the relationship, but kind of how it builds a frame for the characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And that dynamic between Merritt and Jane, it absolutely in Merritt's mind starts as I want to be her. And I think also that I'm surprised that I don't feel competitive with her and that she does not feel competitive with me, because as women, patriarchy, we're like told that we're not really allies, and they're instantly allies. Mm-hmm. But there are moments in the scene which delight me even as the writer, because I didn't write them as breadcrumbs to their future relationship, but they're there. Like Merritt just wondered if she was wearing underwear. I mean, that's a really weird thing to wonder about a woman in an interview. You know what I mean? She's, you know, her eyes are distracting. She's very focused on Jane's blue eyes. She's studying her mouth as she speaks. You know, it's all these sort of flirty sexual like chemistry vibes. But Merritt in that moment doesn't perceive them, but they're there from the beginning, which I think somewhere along the line writing this book, I realized I was writing a story of love at first sight. That yes, it takes a while for them to get there. It's like if I were being told by like a screenwriter, like plot out this book, I would have had them get to it much earlier, but they don't because they need the time to be everything else to each other first. But so I think that the dynamic of do I want to beat her and or do I want to sleep with her is absolutely there. I think it was there for me as a like unknowingly queer person for the first 39 years of my life. I was taken with women, and I thought that I was taken with them because I aspired to be like them. Now I realize, like, no, I'm just super attracted to them. I was looking at their butt, not because I wanted to have a butt like theirs, but because I wanted to look at their butt. But I didn't like, that was how, you know, it worked sort of on the subconscious. But in terms of I love your question too about how queerness functions in the book overall. You know, there are some gay couples that they interact with at work. You know, they're in San Francisco, which is like a very gay city. So like there's the opportunity for queerness to be a nothing burger contextually, which I wanted it to be. But I think that what we experience, and there's a scene in chapter 3 where Merritt and Jane are talking about Merritt's experience at her son's birthday party and how she just felt like she didn't fit in. And Jane, you know, likens it, analogizes to an experience when she goes back to Denmark, and they kind of acknowledge their otherness and feeling like an alien among crowds. And I, like, personally, that resonates so deeply with me in my own experience, you know, from childhood, just feeling kind of weird, you know, and now queerness for me is a way to look back on that and think that was what that was. It's not just that I was like, you know, didn't realize I was attracted to girls and all that. It's sort of like an othering that I experienced culturally that I couldn't have put my name on or put a name on. And it's why for me, I love the word queer now. Like I use it more than any other definer because it captures these other quirky parts of my personality. And people on here who went to high school with me, who may be chiming in, like knew that about me. Like I was a little weird. Like in some part of my life, I decided when I got married, I was going to like start performing as not weird. And everything kind of went downhill from there. But the weird is back. And so is the queer.
Amen.
In full force. Yeah.
Grateful for that. You said something interesting to me about how, you know, in some ways you wish maybe, I don't mean to rephrase for you, but reflecting back, this idea that Jane and Merritt took their time to fall in love, but it's really a love at first sight. And I also think that there's something so beautiful about how they come to this big love through really deep and developed friendship. Like I really actually enjoyed like the pacing of it and seeing them really create this foundation of friendship. And I'm wondering what that meant to you to get to dive into that friendship with them.
Yeah. I mean, for me, even before I knew just how deeply, or how deeply Merritt and Jane would fall in love with each other and how profound that would be, I knew that I was writing a book about intimacy and the lack of intimacy in marriage and the intimacy in female friendships. I was really taken, this is a sidebar, but I was really taken with this idea that if you're a straight woman, you can't have an emotional affair with a woman. Like your husband doesn't get mad at you. He's like relieved that he doesn't have to like listen, you know, he's like offloading you to deal with your like girlness with like another girl. And it's funny because like so many of us, if you're straight and you're having a friendship like that with a woman and it was with a man, your mate, your partner would be like, that's inappropriate. So I was really taken with this. I knew I wanted them to have every aspect of what we would call an emotional affair in this friendship. But yeah, so I knew it was about intimacy, and I just wanted to give them all of the markers that bring people together and how we show up for each other. So like, you know, there's work stuff, there's marital issues, there's health concerns. Then I needed them to have a really epic fight because how you fight and whether you heal from a fight is right. And then I needed them to interact socially and also in the workplace. So it wasn't so much like I was checking off a list, but a little bit I was, because I was looking at what are these markers? How do we become intimate? How do we feel safe with people? What do we have to, like holding someone's hand? I mean, I did this for a very close friend, holding someone's hand with a cancer scare. You're different friends after that. So I wanted to give them all those experiences ahead of time. And also the other thing I'll say that I love about them and the story, and it's something that like I taught myself in this book, is that what Merritt and Jane have is the opposite of what culture tells us a romantic relationship is supposed to be. Because usually it's like sparks fly, the chemistry is great, we go on dates, it's romantic, we kiss, and then we're like, can we actually be intimate long-term, emotionally intimate? And often I think we don't get there. That's the problem with a lot of marriages. But they already fully know each other and are so intimate. And I think part of it is that they never expected it to be romantic. So it's like that lens isn't clouding how they're relating. So it's like a great alchemic situation. It's like all this pipeline has been laid and now we're actually attracted to each other. Like, whoa. So it's fun for me, that sort of explosive moment after all that.
Yeah, I loved the gray areas that their relationship existed in. Yeah, and I think that another element of queerness, right? Like coming into romantic, like what we think of as romance looking very different. And to your point, really maybe romance is about intimacy. I'm grateful for them and for you. I am like, one of the things, that really speaks to me is the age and stage of life that Merritt is in. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why 39, almost 40? Like what about that stage of life sings in this book?
Yeah, as the idea was being crafted, I mean, first of all, I was 39 when I started writing it, but more than that, I had just finished reading Richard Rohr's Falling Upwards book, which is about the two halves of life. I love Richard Rohr. And I was really aware of my own transition into the second half of life and realizing that sort of like there was sort of a putting away of the first half and being a different creature. And both for me, like personally, but also theologically and socially and culturally, like just things shifted. And so for me, it's the truest coming of age I've ever had. I didn't at 18 or 20, like I was very much just a continuation of the former person that I was. And it wasn't until my late 30s and like crossing that threshold into 40 that I felt myself sort of really cleaving. And maybe I'm just like late Arrested Development, like, I don't know, failure to launch, but like that was the time I was really cleaving from my parents. And I was really cleaving from my husband, not in a divorce situation yet, but sort of in the sense of, I'm having a point of view, both as a parent, as a woman, as a view, like politically, we started to disagree more. It's just, I sort of like found myself, and I saw that happening with women I knew everywhere. I saw 40 as this marker. They're terrified to hit 40. You feel so old, you're stressed, you like have a pit in your stomach, you hit 40 and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm happier than I've ever been. And I feel good in my body. I like how I look. The sex I'm having is better. I know what I'm into. And so I wanted to just track with Merritt during that pivotal period.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I'm turning 40 next week. So I really appreciate hearing this.
And you're going to be like, look who I am now.
The best. That's awesome. Well, I mean, I think on not the other side, but Jane is approaching 60 in the book. And was there significance for you in charting that age difference? And that element to their relationship is I would say a part of it, but it's not, I mean, I think I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. I mean, like the stone cold truth is, I'm attracted to older women. So I think, and I didn't realize it when I started, but looking back, I was like, oh, I just created like a sex object. Just gonna be honest, you get to write what you want. You get to write your love interest to be what you would be interested in. But more than that, I really wanted to look at female aging as a book. I mean, that's part of it. See Merritt, stressed about how her body looks post kids, and like, is she fit enough, and does she need Botox, and like all these questions throughout the novel. And so I wanted to have Jane, because I've had this experience, an older woman, quite a bit older, who Merritt finds riveting and beautiful and like not lacking at anything. And so in loving Jane, Merritt actually begins to love herself, which you want that to be in any love relationship. But I think particularly for women to sort of be like, you know, Jane's like pulling at her eye lines and like her saggy, crepey skin. You know, she's pretty self-confident, but she has that stuff, the negative self-talk that all women have. And Merritt like looks at her and thinks, you're crazy, you're gorgeous. Like, and I think realizing the insanity of Jane's self-deprecation helps Merritt to see the insanity of her own. And so I wanted to sort of put that on the page, because I think the women act as mirrors to themselves. You know, Merritt reminds Jane of like her almost her vigor, because she's amazing at work and she's so super talented, but she's in a really lackluster marriage and she's belittled by her husband, and he, you know, she doesn't have as strong of personhood at home. And so I think in the context of Merritt, someone who actually sees Jane for how amazing she is, Jane remembers her own awesomeness. You know, Jane isn't a woman who walked into the room and like, she's fronting a lot when she walks in the room, you know, trying to present in a profession dominated by men. And Merritt helps to be like, no, but I see you. And Jane does it back to Merritt. I see you right back. So I think the age difference like really helps with that dynamic.
Yeah. So you mentioned Richard Rohr and you dropped the word theology, and you know you're talking to a seminary student. So I was also paying attention to the way that faith shows up in this book. And there's some really tender moments where Merritt turns to God in church and in prayer. I want to hear more from you about that. I also would like to read just like a very small passage from the book where Merritt is in church, actually, because the writing is just stunning. So this is Merritt, and I'm just going to read a few sentences. She would carry her feelings with her to a beautiful cathedral in Soma one Saturday morning in January, where she would find herself kneeling at the marble altar in her workout clothes instead of doing hot yoga at the studio next door. Through all of it, Merritt would nurse this truth inside her the way a gardener might tend to a garden, or a bird might sit on an egg, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment when it would burst through the surface into life. And I was first of all, the language is just stunning. And I was really taken with the fact that she is a woman who's talking about queerness inside of a church. And that is not a narrative that we often see. And so I would love to hear you just wax poetic a little bit on faith and the role it plays in this book and in your life, and how you see queerness and faith kind of come together.
Yeah, I love that passage too. And just like small anecdotal story, my editor, I don't remember why, but she pitched like putting that scene at the beginning of the next chapter. And I fought it. I was like, no, it's an end. It's the end of that chapter. Those words have to end that moment. And like, so thank you for loving that passage. I do actually. So let's see where to begin. Because on how I wove faith into the book is one answer, but I guess I'll start with my own experience. When I was first started working on this book, I went to I thought it was totally fiction. You know, I had no idea. I was very straight. I thought very married. I was just writing this book because it was interesting to me. And I thought I was using like physical intimacy among women as like a metaphor for a fulsome intimacy. You know, I told myself these stories. And I started that summer of 2019 towards the fall, started beginning to have the inklings of that it was real for me. And I went to a writing retreat with Dani Shapiro, who is my favorite author of all time, and her book Devotion. Like, if you haven't read it, please read Devotion. It's incredible. I was going to a writing retreat with her in Connecticut, and I got in a day early, and I was kind of like, you know, cruising around the Berkshires. And I pulled over at this church, this beautiful white church, and I went inside. And I mean, I should probably write this just for my own benefit, just recollecting it before I lose it. But I went into this dark church. I was the only one there. And it was, there was a man like cleaning, and it was a musty smell of pews and paper and, you know, that an old church would smell. And I started praying, and I didn't intend to pray this, but I began to cry. And I basically said to God out of nowhere, I am not talking to you about this thing that I know about myself, because I am afraid you're going to tell me. I mean, I might tear up saying it. I'm afraid you're going to tell me that I can't do anything about it. I just have to live with it. And I got to stay married, and I can't be with women. And so I'm afraid to tell you, but obviously, you know, because you're God. And I'm really scared. And I started to cry and sort of offered that as a prayer, the way that Merritt does. And it's interesting. I didn't have a, like God's voice being like, you are loved, go be gay, you know, but I also didn't feel what I expected, which was like that gut guilt of like, you can't do this. You're right. You can't do this. And how dare you, and repent, or all this stuff. I felt none of that. And as I was in that moment, the weirdest thing, the lights in the church started to come on pew by pew. And they was just lighting up. And then the last one was like lit up on Jesus on the altar. And it was such an incredible moment for me. I did feel so loved. And I felt just a sense of like my own okayness. Like, it wasn't like sort of the sense of like, why do you need a blessing from me? This is how I made you to be. You've just told me something true. You know what I mean? Just go be you, do the right thing. So I left, I went outside, and I went to there's a cemetery at the church, and I was looking out at it, and I've always been sort of preoccupied with my own death. And so I was looking at it, and I was thinking about this amazing moment I had, and this like angel statue. It's so strange, but this angel statue that was like on a headstone, big, was like calling to me. So strange. It was like, go look at that. It was the weirdest thing. I was like, I'm not going to go look at it. I'm not superstitious. I went and looked at it. The headstone just said Jane. Isn't that weird? So weird. I was like, okay, I'll keep writing. I'll keep living. So anyway, so that's my story. So in the book, I put in the first draft, before it went to my agent, I put a lot of faith stuff in there. Because I'm a person of faith, and it was really important to me. So I wanted Merritt to be that. And it wasn't really working as a device, not as a device, but like in the book, it wasn't working because I didn't want the book to be about faith. I didn't want her to be the core struggle to be, I'm a woman of faith. Can I be queer? Like that was not the book I was.
Right.
So I needed to back that down a little bit because I wasn't using it enough. It was sort of like I was layering in all this Christian and faith stuff, but it wasn't the core purpose of the book. So it wasn't totally working. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to really elevate her parents, like her background. You know, I didn't have evangelical parents. Like I gave her evangelical parents. I made her from Florida, where it has a particular vibe. So then I decided I just wanted Merritt's faith to be just backdrop. I didn't want it to have to be a thing because in fiction, we often have this thing where either it's like faith is everything to the character, or God's not mentioned. So I wanted it to be subtle. Like so many of us have relationships with God. It's not, not all of us are seminary students, and we still, you know what I mean? Like for not everyone, it's, anyway, so I just wanted to layer it in as like a backdrop. So thank you for liking it, thinking it works. Yeah. I've never been sure about the faith stuff and how it plays, but it's there.
No, I really appreciated the subtlety of it and the presence of it. Both things were noticed, and both things meant a lot to me. And you're right, not everybody has to be a seminary student. In fact, that's a whole thing we can talk about another day. But it is, it meant a lot to get to see the queerness and faith not being pitted against each other, but being in relationship to one another. So thank you.
And Merritt doesn't have an important thing for me in this story. And, I wonder, as like friends and relatives, more conservative friends and relatives read it, how they'll respond to it. But it was Merritt's lack of guilt about her queerness, and even about the affair, the act of it. She doesn't feel guilty about it. And that was something I did intentionally. She feels very guilty about the lie to Corey. And she feels guilty about this sort of like trying to lead the double life, and how she starts to drop the ball with her kids. She starts to realize like, I can't play anymore. I have this other life that I'm in, but she doesn't wake up in a shame spiral. and be like, what have I done? And I've been with a woman, and what is my mom going to say? You know, that's not part of her internal narrative. And that was important to me because I didn't want her to self-hate after like discovering her queerness, which people might think, you know, she should self-hate, but I, for one, she felt very alive and I was happy for her, you know?
Yeah, me too. I think it goes back to a little bit about what you were talking about in the green room about pandering. And, you know, there's been a quote running in my head from Melissa Febos this week about rejecting the patriarchy's bad ideas, and guilt around desire and love feels like a bad idea. So I think that you've shown us a way to reject that, but also holding on to, like you said, the quality of relationships and the ethics of being in positive relationships with people, because that's still very present in the book too.
Yeah, absolutely. Merritt should have said, wow, I'm having these feelings. Hey, Corey, like, I'm having these feelings. Our marriage isn't great. Maybe we should separate. I want to explore this. Should we open up our marriage? I mean, there's so many ways she could have done this in an evolved, healthy way. You know, and some people are like, I hate marriage. She doesn't communicate to her husband and she checks out of her life. I'm like, that's called conflict. That's like, if we went to Corey, I want to explore my queerness. And he's like, great, let's open up our marriage. I'll give you space. She comes back and says, I mean, that's an amazing, beautiful story. But it wasn't allowing me to kind of like play with all these ideas. So she could have done it better, but I like to believe over the course of her life, and there are breadcrumbs here towards the end, no spoilers, that she makes things right, you know, ultimately.
Yeah, she does. I promise I'll get back to some fun stuff, but I wanted to also talk a little bit about grief and how I see grief from multiple perspectives in the book. And I wondered how you see grief playing out in the story, and also maybe the role that it's played in your life. I think about grief, of course, of losing a loved one, but also just transforming relationships and unmet expectations, and kind of the more subtle ways that we carry grief, especially at this age and stage that we're at.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess I don't want to do spoilers on what exactly Merritt's grieving, but there are moments of grief, like very sort of palpable, present grief in the novel. And I wanted those to function both as sort of, I guess, plot points, the word, these moments in our lives that arrest us, you know, when something happens that we grieve, like everything sort of stops. We're on a course and then something happens, you get a phone call, whatever it is, and like everything's different and everything comes into sharp focus and you decide like who you are, what do you want to do now? So I knew I wanted that. I also, for me, all the plot points, I try to make them also function on a metaphorical level. So these moments of, you know, the present palpable grief is allowing Merritt to feel her own grief about the state of her life and sort of the perceived impossibility of her situation, which I think in my own life and in Merritt's not early life, but early in the novel, she's unhappy and grieving the loss of the expectation of the sort of marriage that she thought she was going to have. I mean, her husband's very avoidant. He works a lot. He doesn't help out a ton. She doesn't feel seen by him. You know, he kind of is like, everything is kind of like a blasé statement and like I don't know, like a catchphrase when she's trying to share. He's like, just says like one thing and hopes it all goes away. And I think she didn't let herself grieve that because she's not supposed to. He's like, doesn't beat her. He's not an alcoholic. He's, you know, he doesn't cheat on her. So she's supposed to like feel really grateful that she has this man. But it is grief that she feels like she's grieving the loss of her art career. I mean, when she goes back to work, there's some shame and embarrassment that it didn't work out, but it's what she really wanted to do. And she had this version of herself before all of this played out where there's one passage where she says she would envision herself like living in Wales, living a wild and artistic life, you know? So I think what she does and what I wanted the book to do, but also we all do in our own lives, we have these micro griefs, you know, and I think sometimes we feel sadness or we feel anger and it's actually grief. And I've come to understand that. And so I wanted Merritt to experience that also in the novel.
I appreciate that frame of a micro grief.
Yeah.
Okay. So I do want to talk about desire because it's there. And, you know, I love that the book has multiple kinds of desire. There's certainly embodied sexual desire, which is written beautifully. But there's also a lot of different kinds of desire around creativity. And what do you think desire is?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this whole book really is, I mean, it is about desire, and it is about how recognizing your desire allows you to recognize all the other ones. And I think we women, just in the patriarchy culturally, but particularly in faith circles, and she came out of, evangelical parents, desire is actually like overtly taught as something that you're supposed to repress. There's so many Bible verses thrown around about, your heart is deceitful above all things, and, not to trust the flesh and all of this stuff. And so I think so Merritt is sort of like in this dialogue with her desires, which like, if I want it, probably I shouldn't want it. Probably that makes me a bad person. Probably I shouldn't, do X, Y, or Z. So when she meets Jane and begins to have feelings for Jane, the desire, there's a phrase in here that I love. I mean, I'm not saying I love it because I wrote it, but I was like, that's it. It was like desire rising like floodwater inside her. And that's the experience that she has. And so I think once she grabs hold of that, she suddenly sees everything that she wants. I mean, she behaves differently after she has her feelings for Jane. It's not like a total abrupt shift, but there are scenes that she is not the same as she was before. And she's not the same at work. She's more authoritative at work. She's not the same among her friends, like her mom friends. She's not even the same with Jane. I mean, she's becomes an initiator. She becomes a little like minxy and sexy. And like, she's finding that in her. My desire is the thing in us that is uniquely ours, the things that we want. And I've been thinking a lot about desire in a faith framework, actually, just sort of back on that. This idea that I'm toying with is this like a voice of God saying, tell me what you desire and I will show you who you are. And I think we need to look at our desires. It's like so many of us want deeply to be loved, and the desires that we have reflect that. And sometimes they're like adaptive desires. We desire our partner or someone who's like we're safe with. And sometimes they're maladaptive. It's like we desire alcohol or drugs to sort of like numb that. But anyway, I think looking at desire and allowing it to have a voice in our lives is like the first path to freedom and also happiness. So,
yeah.
So she's full of wants. And I said of myself, paralleling to Merritt, I remember I said to someone, like my own journey with queerness, I could not recall wanting something the way I ultimately came to like want to be with women. It felt so uniquely mine. It was like, sure, I wanted to like get into a good college. I wanted to like do well at work. In theory, I wanted to have a baby, maybe. But that desire felt so uniquely mine, and it felt like it didn't come from anywhere but me. And that was great.
I want to make sure to get to this question in the chat, and y'all, if you have other questions, make sure to pop them in the box. But this is a great question. What is your personal take on the idea of being a late bloomer and how that's navigated in the LGBTQ plus community today, especially among cisgender queers? Did coming out late influence the unfolding and outcome of the storyline in any way?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. For me, I guess the first place I go with that question is the degree to which queerness functions as an identity marker. For Merritt, it doesn't a lot in the book. It's like she and Jane kind of joke about their labels, and it isn't a huge, Merritt doesn't, because she's in San Francisco, and because she's established and, has a life and is sort of situated, there aren't a lot of obstacles to overcome to sort of be gay, to sort of love Jane. And I did that on purpose because I feel like we don't have a lot of stories like that, but also I wasn't writing a coming out story really. I was writing a love story that involved in coming out. So I think it's tricky because it's like, are Merritt and Jane like really gay? You know, it's like the question is like, do they get to claim their gayness because they love one another? Or like, do we need to tell Merritt, like, no, honey, if you're attracted to women, you can't love this, you know, you need to go like sow your oats and explore your queerness and figure out who you really are? Or do we like allow her to come at this as a grown woman and decide to be with one woman? I mean, again, no spoilers about how she navigates her life with Jane, but that was interesting to me of like, how do I give Merritt sort of that like almost teenage experience? I mean, her desire kind of like lights her up, and like she's like thinking about sex and like can't think about anything else. I mean, I didn't have that in my late 30s in my marriage. I didn't sit around thinking about sex when I was making dinner, you know, but Merritt, lit up by Jane, like suddenly does, right? So anyway, I don't know exactly if that answers the question, but I wanted it to be both like a non-event, the coming out in terms of culturally, but also I wanted to give her that experience of feeling giddy and feeling young in it and feeling like her old self. And then a third thing layer into that, but I didn't want her to always behave immaturely because I wanted her to actually be coming into her maturity. And it was hard. Like, it was hard to sort of like, because, you know, like, do I make her seem, you know, checked out of her life, or like she's acting out when she's like drinking with Jane and having sex and lying to her husband? But also, you know, I wanted her to be able to claim something for herself at the same time. For my own experience, it's like the late bloomer thing has been interesting. I mean, it's hard to, people are like a little skeptical. They're sort of like, oh, are you bi? You must be bi, or you're going to go back to a man. You know, it's like you sort of have to really dig in and be like, no, I'm real gay. Like I'm real gay. But the truth is, like, the thing that I say about myself and the thing about Merritt is like, I'm 42 years old. Like, I know myself pretty well. So like, people are like, how do you know if you know? And I'm like, because I'm 42 years old. Like I know a lot about myself. So anyway, I don't know if that answers the questions, but the late bloomer aspect is like fresh in my mind, and definitely was an experience that Merritt had.
Yeah, I identify with that too. Yeah, I get the how did you not know question a lot. And it's like, well, I do now. So that's all that matters. Yeah.
When the narrative, people are really focused on, well, so were you gay all along? Did you have things? And I'm sort of like, I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. It just matters how I am now. I mean, certainly looking back, the thing we were talking about at the beginning, I look at my relationship with women, and I look at like particularly older women who I sort of like girl crushed on and thought they were like mentors, but really I was like crushing on them. Those little pieces, you know, fit together. But, you know, for me, the journey, it's all of it is important, you know, all the things that came before to right now. So,
yeah. So, Lauren, what do you hope people take away from reading this book?
I think I would like people to imagine, women in particular, although, you know, I hope men read it too, imagine for themselves what like their Jane is. Not a woman, not your older boss who you fall in love with, but just what's the thing that, I mean, the publisher wrote the tagline on the book, you know, I didn't write it, you know, the spark that makes you feel whole again. And I see so often with friends who are perfectly happy, but don't feel sparky, you know? And so for some people, it might be going back to school. Some people, it might be like exploring a new hobby, you know, getting in therapy with your existing partner. Maybe it's leaving a marriage. I mean, I'm not like a proponent of divorce, but for some people, it's the right thing. And I want for both people Merritt's age and people's Jane's age, like the midlife and on, to think it's still possible to have like a really electric life. I mean, I want that. And Merritt gets that, you know, Jane gets that. Jane's 60 years old and her life is upended by this relationship. And like, there's plenty of years to go. So that's what it is. Like, that there is a spark and it's worth finding, because being lit up is like being truly alive. And I'll say, like, personally, I I used to be super preoccupied with like the passage of time and my own death and how old I was getting so quickly and how the time is going. I'll tell you, like coming out and sort of owning this aspect of me, all of that went away. And it's like another Richard Rohr thing. He says, I think the people who are most afraid of dying are those who have never really been alive. And it just resonates with me so deeply. So be alive would be the takeaway.
I love it. So do you have any tips of the trade for writers out there that have a story that's maybe bubbling up that they just can't look away from?
Yeah, I've gotten really interested in sort of like owning the role of our subconscious and the idea that stories that we're not actually, and maybe this was just me, but I always just thought like I'm muscling this. Like I have an idea, I got to plot it, I got to figure it out. And now I'm like, no, stories are out there and we become vessels and they're in us. And so that little idea that you're kicking around, that was like given to you. So you better pay attention to it because someone's handed you something, be a good steward of it. And so for me, handwriting in a notebook and stream of consciousness writing has become the thing that I do to crack story. I don't think like what should happen first, beat one, which I used to with my YA novels, but I'm really enjoying letting my subconscious like tell me. And there's this writing coach, his name is Al Watts. He writes, he teaches courses, but he also has books. One's called The 90-Day Novel. And I mean, I don't recommend anyone try to write a book in 90 days, but his book, there's an audiobook and I use it like a class. I just listen to it on Audible because he's like day one and it's stream of consciousness exercises about your character. And you just submit to the process. You don't worry about the outcome. You're just like, I'm going to do what he says. It's 5 minutes. There's 5 exercises, 5 minutes, spend half an hour a day. And sort of just like stop trying to muscle it. So I would say write by hand, get a notebook, ideally one that like fits in the bag that you carry most often. So you can always have it with you. And, maybe try Al's book or, just Google like stream of consciousness exercises. Or I've started doing this prayer thing. This is not related to writing, but Liz Gilbert, I went to a conference with Elizabeth Gilbert and she talks about doing two-way prayer, which she started doing in recovery, where she writes like, Dear God, what would you have me know today? And then just free writes God's response. It's incredible. Highly recommend doing that if you're a person of faith, because what comes out is not what you think. It's very strange. Like, God, is this me? Like, what's happening? But that's another thing I think would work for if you had a character. If you said like, Dear Merritt, what do you want to tell me today? And just like speak. So I guess that'd be my advice. Write every day, write by hand, and don't like panic. Just believe that the story will come out if you can just get out of the way, I think.
I love it. I just want to know, like, what are you excited about reading these days, if you have any time at all?
Yeah, I'm very excited to read, and every time I've told someone about this book, I've botched the title, which as an author, like I should owe this. What We Do in the Dark, you'll know what it is, right? It comes out in like a couple weeks. Is that what it's called? What We Do in the Dark? Anyway, I'm so excited. It's another sort of, it's queer and it's an age difference. It's a teacher and a student in the wake of a death. I'm really super excited to read that. And then Rebecca Wolf's memoir, All of This, comes out, I think, in June. So those are my two most excited, like I'm most excited to read. I've been reading a ton. I'm working on a new book that is harder. It's harder than I expected. It's taking longer than I thought, but I'm trying to take my own advice and submit to the process. So I'm reading a ton of stuff on like goddess culture and Greek goddesses. And that's been really fun. Like older books from the 90s, analyzing like the patriarchal telling of goddess stories and reclaiming them and realizing women writers were doing this in the early 90s. And like, it feels so relevant. It's like what we're doing now, but in the 90s were like, these stories are really jacked and not the right telling. And anyway, so I'm also reading a lot in that area.
That's awesome. Melanie in the chat has, first of all, you've inspired her to get underway with her writing, which is awesome. And also shouts out Pages for You by Sylvia Brownrigg.
Yes, I haven't. I would love to. Okay, done.
And y'all, we've got another question. I was going to ask. Another great one. What do you think your next novel is going to be about?
So the one I'm working on is about, if I can crack it, it's a story of a woman who sort of loosely like comes to the end of herself to kind of figure out who she really is, which is like the Vegas pitch. But I want to look at colonialism, but the colonial history of California, and the way that faith intersects with that, or at least the Catholic Church with the mission system in California, and how Indigenous people were treated and mistreated. But also to have that be a frame, a story that's situated there, but also looking at how we are all colonized by the patriarchy, such that we've all been assimilated. And so we have thoughts that aren't our thoughts. We have thoughts that we think are original thoughts, but they are not. It's the same. It's the bad ideas. It's the patriarchy's bad ideas. So I want to write a story about a woman who, in a deeply subconscious way, her subconscious begins to sort of like almost make her go crazy as she begins to strip away, dismantle the sort of patriarchal overlay in her life. I know that sounds like really wacky, but that's the book. In the midst of writing it, I had this idea for a lesbian movie that came to me so swiftly and is writing itself so quickly that I put the book aside and I'm writing this lesbian movie, which I pitch as, and I hope everyone here will watch it if it ever gets made in some future time. I'm pitching it as, and I hesitate because maybe not everyone loves this movie and book as much as I do, but I'm pitching it as Beaches with Lesbians. So basically,
nice.
A child relationship that then over years and the fraught friendship, but it's actually a love affair over time, sort of a saga with then like a health event towards the end that brings them back together. Because I really the movie is about the different experiences of queerness between two women who fall deeply in love in high school, but then are torn apart. And one is a pastor's daughter, and so just goes and conforms and gets married and has kids. And the other moves out to LA and lives out, and it has the struggles of being a lesbian and like all what that entails, but just like side by side, how the repressed, closeted one's life is actually a lot harder. So, but yet they can be there for each other. So anyway, I'm writing that movie. Maybe that'll become a book if like I write the movie and I'm like, oh great, maybe I'll just make it a novel. So it's all gay. Everything I'm writing is gay. I'll tell you that. So I hope you guys are in for that.
Well, we can't wait. I can't wait. And before I invite ER back, is there anything you wish I had asked or that the group had asked that didn't get asked?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess this is sort of a weird thing to say, but even with my YA novels and with this novel too, and I had not thought to say this, so I'm just going with it. I suffered from, or the book suffered from, their failure to belong properly in any genre. And I'm a little like this book, I think it is struggling a bit in that same way too, because, it's not overtly, I mean, it's not a lesbian story from start to finish, and it's definitely an LGBTQ story, but like, does it properly belong on like the queerest shelves? I mean, I hope so, but I'm not sure. But then on this sort of like straight mainstream shelves, it's like a queer romance. So there's been sort of almost like a diminishing quality of it, of sort of like, oh, this is just a queer this is being pitched as literary fiction. This is just a queer romance. And so I don't know if you guys read the book and like the book, to sort of like evangelize it as to people in all the categories, because I think there's something in it. And I'm feeling the book already kind of like getting relegated to different places. And I don't know. I mean, I obviously wrote it so I want people to read it, but I want people to talk about the ideas, because I think there's a lot here, and I've tried to do justice to the story, but beyond the story, just the themes I think are worth talking about. So tell people about it and like give it to your straight friends and your gay friends, and don't put it in a box, I guess.
I could not agree more. There's so much there. It's so deep. It's so fun to read too. I mean, it really is all of it. So
and there's
I'm looking for
guide. There's a book club guide on my website that Putnam put together, laurenmcbrayer.com. I think it's in resources, or maybe it just says book club guide. Anyway, you can print it. The questions are great. I didn't write them, and there's a little Q&A. So if anyone wants a book club guide, you can get it there.
You have an evangelist in me and many here, I'm sure. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this time and for writing this beautiful book and for being in conversation with me.
Well, thank you all for being my people. It feels like such a safe space. So I'm so happy to be here. It's been great.
Yeah.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you both so much. It's interesting to think about where, we are just shelving your book in literary fiction, and sort of how we think about the differences between what constitutes a romance, like a book which contains romance, and particularly like queer or lesbian romance, versus what is a lesbian romance, has a lot to do with the history of genre publishing, right? Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, we only housed lesbian romances by lesbian presses in that section. And because of, the mainstreaming actually of some lesbian romances, now it's like, oh, well, would we put books that contain lesbian romance in this section or not, right? It's an interesting genre question. And mostly what we've done is sort of cross list, right? And keep literary fiction that includes romance in literary fiction, but say, it's not an explicit genre book in that way. But when people are,
I was just gonna say, like, thank you for doing that, because so often, romance, particularly written by women, everyone feels a need to like, oh, it's romance, so it's not literary fiction. So like to include romance stories in literary fiction is like great for women, great for romance. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, but also, romance readers have very specific genre expectations and conventions and don't like it if your romance doesn't adhere to those. So it's also a disservice in every direction a lot of the time to shelf things. And I think that's what people often misunderstand is like, romance readers want a certain plot, and that's part of the fun of it, right? And so if you go in there and you're like, oh, actually there's this other subplot in here, people are going to be like, why is this in here? Like, this is not what I signed up
for. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think it's useful. I don't know if there are other booksellers watching, but that's something that we talk a lot about at Charis. Like, where does this book belong? And if people come in and they say, well, I want a love story, right? And then we can be like, okay, like what are you looking for? Like, do you want something that sort of goes down easy, or do you want something that reflects the difficult realities of love, right? And sometimes those are different. Sometimes people want both, in the same shopping trip. But often people want different things at different times. So it is always an interesting question as a bookseller. So thank you for raising that at the end, because it's definitely important. And what we find is, bookstores reflect what the booksellers think about the world much more than they reflect how books are marketed a lot of the time. So we want to encourage folks, if you've enjoyed tonight, please click on this teal link to buy Like a House on Fire from Charis. It really does help us when you buy. It's got a great cover. It really does help us when you buy books directly from us. And tell your friends. This event will be up on our YouTube page probably in about a day, so check it out there. You can share that link. You can also, of course, share this link, but on the YouTube page, folks don't have to register, so that's a little bit easier. And tomorrow is Independent Bookstore Day, so we would love if you would like to celebrate with us. We will be at Charis from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. celebrating Independent Bookstore Day with lots of merch and lots of fun and community. So we'd love for folks to come by and see us. And if you are not in town, go to your local indie, wherever that is, and give them some love. Buy a book, buy Lauren's book, if not from us, from your local indie. So thank you, Susan, for always being a wonderful reader and interviewer. And thank you so much, Lauren, for celebrating this book with us. We're really excited for you and excited for you to write a whole bunch more gay stuff.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. It was so fun. Really fun. And I will definitely be in next time I'm home. This summer I'll be home. I will be banging on the door. So
awesome. Bring your kids too, because we have a giant, kid section too.
I love it. I will.
Awesome. All right. Take care, y'all. Thank you.